The secret to getting good pictures is to get a goddamn prime lens. Well, COVID cases are rising again, and lockdowns extended another time. Which means you have more time to stay home and tap into that creative outlet. Just like everyone else and their moms. Jokes aside, you're a budding photographer. You want to pursue photography whether it's as a hobby or as a profession, and you get yourself your first camera, just like this one over here. Now, when you first get it, you might be really intimidated because there's so many features on this camera, and you learn that there's more to just point and click when it comes to taking good photos. And that's why I'm here. The random dude on YouTube who has no track record of doing photography tutorials. This video is less of a tutorial and more of a tips and tricks I've learned when I first started doing photography. I hope by the end of this video that you have a better understanding of how you should proceed with your photography adventure. I hope it doesn't matter what camera brand you get. You haven't bought a camera yet, and you're asking yourself what camera brand I should get. There's so many brands to pick from. You got your Canons, you got your Nikons, you got your Sonys, you got your Olympus, you got your Fujifilms, and many others out there. And that can be really intimidating. You don't know what kind of camera works best for you. I think as a beginner, it really doesn't matter. As a beginner, you're not going to notice the different nuances that each camera brand provides. So don't be stressed out about what camera you first pick. You can always return it. You can always, return it. Most people can't tell the difference, especially if you're a beginner. When I first got my camera, I really only knew about Canons and Nikons, and I just chose Nikon because I thought, Canon was too mainstream. I wanted to be the cool kid in the neighborhood. And let's get this out of the way. Photography is an expensive hobby, but it doesn't mean that your first camera has to be a super expensive one or the newest model. You can always buy a model that's many years old and still get pictures that look really good. You can also go somewhere, say on like Craigslist, and buy a used camera, or you can also rent a camera to see if it works out for you. And also, as a beginner, I wouldn't worry too much about what lens you get. Just work with the standard kit lens that comes with the camera body. Start with the most basic functions on your camera and work slowly towards learning the technical details of taking good pictures. I'm going to lay out what I think is a good learning progression for beginner photographers. When you first get your DSLR or mirrorless camera, I would highly recommend taking pictures on auto mode. The camera will select your shutter speed, ISO, and aperture for you, as well as the white balance, so that you don't have to worry about some of these other technical details. Now, you're probably asking yourself, well, if I do that, I can't learn how to be a good photographer, and I think that's false. Here are some of the things I think you can still learn on auto mode. Number 1, you can learn how to hold the camera properly. And I know this is like the most obvious thing. What's so hard about holding a camera? But it's usually the first thing that introductory photography courses teach you. It's surprising when I give my camera to my friends and I see them struggle to hold the camera in a stable position or hold the camera in such a way so you can get a photo in a nice leveled way. And this is especially important later on when you're taking pictures at a lower shutter speed. So it's really important to hold the camera very steadily so that your cameras don't turn out very blurry. To hold your camera steadily, you want to grip the bottom of the lens with one hand and the side of your camera body with the other. You're going to place your index finger on the trigger. Then you're going to use your elbows as kind of a tripod against your torso. Lightly press to autofocus, then full press for a shot. The second thing you can learn is composition. Composition is basically the relative position of your subjects in your photo. It can seem really obvious, but if you've ever had your friends or your parents take pictures on, say, your iPhone, sometimes they don't look that good. And that's because they're, cutting things off frame when they shouldn't be, or supposed to be center, but it's off center, and, some basic things like that. A simple example of what you should be asking yourself is, do I want my subject to be center frame, or do I want to use the rule of thirds and have my subject off center? You want to be playing around with framing and positioning of your subject as much as possible so that in the future you have a much better sense of composition. The third important thing that you can learn on a camera on auto mode is focal length. Now, focal length is the technical term for how zoomed in your lens is going to be. For example, 16 millimeters is probably a very wide view. 50 millimeters is usually what you see in nice portraits, and maybe 100 to 200 millimeters are your standard telephoto lens focal lengths. For reference, here's all the images overlapped each other. Focal length determines more than just how zoomed in your picture is going to be. If I shoot a subject on a wide angle lens and a portrait lens, but the subject is the same relative size in both of the photos, you're going to notice a huge difference. In the picture taken on a wide angle lens on the right, you can notice a lot more spatial distortion. Not only is my face more spread out, but you can notice the depth between my nose, eyes, and ears. Whereas on the portrait lens on the left, my features are a lot more flattened out, and I'm a lot more compact. The higher your focal length is, the more flattened out your subjects are going to be, and the less spatial distortion you're going to see. So once you've gotten used to shooting on auto mode for a while, it's time to move away from auto mode and learn how to shoot your camera manually. The three most important things you have to learn are ISO, are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These three things are all ways you control how much light or how bright your picture is going to be, but they all serve different side effects. Let's start with aperture. Aperture is basically the size of the hole the light comes in to your camera. Aperture is measured in what's called f-stops. The smaller your f-stop number is, the wider the aperture is going to be, which means that you're going to get more light and therefore a brighter picture. The other side effect of aperture is that it determines your depth of field. Depth of field determines how much space in front of the camera is going to be in focus. Notice how the lens in the front and the bottle in the back gets clearer as you go to the right. In general, a wider aperture means that you're getting a very small depth of field. And this is what's associated normally with good-looking portraits, where the person is super in focus, but the background and foreground is very blurry and has this beautiful effect called bokeh. The second thing you have to know is shutter speed. Shutter speed, it's super simple. It determines how fast your shutter is, or how long it stays open for. The longer it stays open for, the more exposed your pictures are going to be, and therefore brighter. Shutter speed is also really important when you're considering moving objects. Say you're taking a picture of a really fast car. Now, I couldn't afford a car for this video, so I simulated a car by running at 40 miles an hour. You'll notice on the image with a very low shutter speed that there's a lot of motion blur, whereas on the image with a very high shutter speed, I'm crystal clear as day. ISO. Past Junho is wrong. ISO is actually the sensitivity level of your sensor. The higher your ISO levels, the brighter your picture is going to turn out to be. ISO is particularly useful to raise when you're in a situation where you can no longer raise your aperture or decrease your shutter speed to get more light. However, raising ISO levels too high is really bad because it introduces a lot of noise to your photos. Your camera is trying to fill in gaps where there's no information because it's too dark, and therefore it's going to fill that dark spots with a lot of grain or noise. Notice on the image on the right where I increased the exposure time rather than the ISO, you can see all the details, the dirt, and scratches on the buckets. I don't like to raise my ISO levels above 1600 unless I'm in a situation where I absolutely have no other light source. Once you've mastered aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, you can then move on to whatever topic you want to learn about in photography. At this point, you're pretty set as an amateur photographer. You can do whatever you want to do. The kit lens you start with is pretty versatile. It has a pretty good range of focal length of 18 to 55 millimeters. However, you're going to notice some limitations, such as a decrease in maximum aperture when you increase your focal length. At some point or another, you're going to want to get a new lens, but just like with camera bodies, there's so many lenses to choose from. So what do you get? As a beginner photographer, I recommend that you get some kind of prime lens. A prime lens is simply a lens with no zoom. It has one focal length. Now you might be asking, wouldn't having one focal length be very inconvenient? And yes, it is, but it comes with so many other benefits. First of all, it's a lot cheaper compared to your standard zoom lens. So as a beginner photographer, you don't have to spend too much money on it. Second of all, it teaches a pretty good lesson in photography as a beginner. Because you're restricted to one focal length, if you want the subject to be of a certain size, you're going to have to walk around physically in space. And as you do this over and over again, you're going to have a better sense and intuition for controlling objects in space, making you a much better photographer. And finally, and arguably the most importantly, you're going to take your photos to the next level just by switching to a prime lens. Here's why. A prime lens generally comes with a much higher maximum aperture. That means you get more light, but also you can create a very shallow depth of field. And again, that shallow depth of field is usually what people associate with those really nice professional looking portraits. Personally, for me, the first lens I bought was this 50mm NIKKOR lens. It served me pretty well in the past 3.5 years, and it's still one of my favorite lenses to this day, and you got it for under $200. Now, after you've bought your prime lens and used it for a while, you might want to consider expanding to other types of lenses. When you're deciding, you should let your passion decide where you want to go with it. If you want to do landscape photography, go get a wide angle lens. If you want to do nature photography or animal photography, you might want to get a telephoto lens. If you want to do pictures of very small things, you might want to get a macro lens. It's really up to you, and you have all the knowledge at your disposal at this point to decide on what lens you want to get. So in summary, number one, it doesn't matter what brand camera body you get. You're not going to notice the difference, and neither are most people. And it doesn't have to be that expensive. It's your first camera. Second of all, start with the most basic functions of your camera and work towards slowly mastering each of the fundamentals that your camera provides. And thirdly, get a prime lens. It'll up your photo game so much more with so little effort. That's all I have to say today. If you're an aspiring photographer, I hope this video helped you out a lot. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. If you think this helped you out, consider leaving a like and subscribe. I've also left a list of my first gear down in the description below. If you're interested in photography, I have an Instagram and a website where I have a lot of cool stuff up there. Yeah, see ya.